start recording. Oh, thanks, Charlotte. So there is a lot that happens in this parasha, and so we have and this phrase. There's a lot of like famous phrases in this parsha. One of them is "Vayakom Melech Hadash al Mitzrayim Asher Lo Yada et Yosef." There arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, right? And this is a fairly common phrase actually in Israel. Somebody loses their job, and you say, why? Why did you lose your job? Yaakov Melech Hadash, right? I mean, there was a change of leadership, and the former people who were grateful to me, who were good to me, who were kind to me, they're not around anymore. And so that's the end of the story, right? But Pharaoh's fear is that the people are gaining the Jews are getting stronger and more numerous, and he seems to be afraid that there'll be an internal fifth column. That if there's a war between Egypt and their enemies, that there'll be a domestic fifth column. And it says, Ka'asher ya'anu oto ken yarbe v'chen yirfroz. Right? The more they oppressed them, the stronger they got. And I've seen in the since October 7th and the rise of visible anti-Semitism in this country and in other countries, I've seen memes that say things like, the more you hate us, the Jewier we get. And there's a certain truth to that. I mean, for the last couple of years, we didn't, when I say we, I mean Kelly, didn't put up Hanukkah decorations. We have lots of lights, and we have like a light thing that's spinning dreidels that projects against the house. And for a while, we didn't do that. And then Kelly said to me, this year we're doing it. Okay. And I didn't ask her exactly why, but I suspect it's precisely, kind of defiance, right? That if they're going to hate us, I mean, and it makes sense in a way. If people are going to hate you for being a Jew, you might as well be a Jew, right? Because they don't just hate observant Jews; they hate all Jews. So if you're going to be hated for being a Jew, then you might as well be a Jew, But and I heard this interestingly when I was in Connecticut. One year, my shul had a Freedom Seder together with the NAACP chapter. And one of the African American pastors said to me, and I had never heard this before, but he explained to me what he understood the significance of the egg on the Seder plate is, which is that the egg is the only food that the longer you cook it, the harder it gets. So it's a symbol of resistance to oppression, right? But so all these oppressive measures don't work. The people only get stronger, right? So what does Pharaoh say? Orders the midwives to kill every newborn Hebrew son, Hebrew male baby, but they refuse. Okay, so these midwives, Shifra and Pua. Okay, now there's lots of midrashim about them, but in terms of what the Torah text tells us, we know very little. Okay, they're called Shifra and Pua Hamiyaldot Ha'ivriot, right? But what does the term Hamiyaldot Ha'ivriot mean? Okay, I mean, word order works differently in Hebrew than in English. So miyaledet in the singular, miyaldot in the plural is midwives, ivriot, Hebrew, right? So they are the Hebrew midwives, right? But that phrase is actually ambiguous. Does it mean, like, my mother used to call herself, because she was a learning disability specialist, she said she was a perceptually impaired teacher, right? It didn't mean that she was a teacher who was perceptually impaired, right? It meant that she was a teacher of the perceptually impaired, right? So the miyaldot ha'ivriot, right, doesn't necessarily mean that they are midwives who are themselves Hebrews. It could mean that they are midwives who take care of the Hebrews, right? In which case, they themselves would not be Hebrew, but Egyptian, right? Egyptian midwives who take care of the Hebrews. Okay. And um, so maybe we read a little bit more and we understand what they did, and this could help us figure out who they are. So then the text says, "Vatirena hameyaldot et ha Elohim." The midwives feared God. Okay, the midwives feared God, or I'm going to go back. Don't translate it as the midwives feared God. Just translate it as the midwives feared Elohim. Okay, now, does this give us any clue as to their identity, whether they are midwives who are Hebrew or simply midwives who take care of the Hebrews? When it says the midwives feared Elohim, what do you think? Right. Well, I mean, the simple answer, right, um, is that they feared God, right? I mean, we say Elohim, right? Eloheinu ve'Elohei avoteinu, right? So that's God. That's the God that we Hebrews worship, right? But here's the thing. Generally, we translate the word as Elohim as God, and that's why I did that originally, right? But it's in the plural, right? I mean, everybody here knows at least enough Hebrew to understand that the word Elohim is actually in the plural, right? But that we say that doesn't matter. It's in the plural, but it refers to God. But sometimes it really refers to gods, like in the second commandment, lo yihye lecha Elohim acherim al panai. You shall not have other Elohim in my presence, right? So there in the second commandment, Elohim does not mean God with a capital G. It means gods in the plural with a small g, right? So um, there is a possibility that they were, in fact, Hebrew midwives, that is to say, midwives who were Hebrew, who feared the Hebrew God, or they could have been Egyptians who came to revere the God of the Hebrews, right? I mean, we're not the only people who worship the God of Israel, right? I mean, Christians worship the God of Israel. They have, from our perspectives, odd ideas about that God, Muslims worship the God of Israel. From our perspective, they have odd ideas, although less odd than the Christian ideas, right? So the fact that they revered the God of Israel doesn't mean that they were themselves Israelites, right? Or they were Egyptians who feared the Egyptian gods, actually feared Elohim in the plural, the Egyptian gods, and that Pharaoh's commandment, right, went too far even under Egyptian morality, right? That even the Egyptians who worshipped multiple gods, they still had a sense of basic morality that emanated from that religion, and they felt that Pharaoh had gone too far, and they refused to obey him. Okay, but there's another possibility, right? They're called Miyaldot HaIvriot, right? And what does the word Ivri mean? All right. One folk etymology is Ivri because the shorish, the root ayin beit resh of um, of Ivri is to cross. Okay, so they crossed over. How did they cross over? Because they looked at the Hebrews and they didn't see an enemy other, but rather a fellow human being, right? In other words, if you divide the world into an us and a them, and you see the them as less than human, right? But now you started to see the them as also human, you have crossed over. You have crossed over the line. You have transgressed, right? You have transgressed. You're a race traitor, right? I mean, if you're a Nazi who starts to see Jews as humans is a race traitor, right? A Klansman who starts to see Black people as humans is a race traitor. They have crossed over. They have crossed over to the other side, right? So the it, midwives start to see the Hebrews as fellow human beings. So Pharaoh takes stronger measures, right? Every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile and let every girl live, right? And this is also an ambiguous verse. Why, right? Which male babies are to be thrown into the Nile? It says all male babies. It doesn't say all male Hebrew babies, right? And there is an understanding of this verse that it means even the Egyptian babies, because maybe the leader of the rebellion against Pharaoh will be an ethnic Egyptian, right? Maybe Pharaoh is scared of a Hebrew rebellion, but he's also perhaps scared of an internal Egyptian war, right? But when Pharaoh's daughter sees this Hebrew baby floating on the Nile in a basket, what does she see? She sees a baby. She sees a baby, not an other, not somebody who's dangerous to her, not, but somebody who's worthy of her compassion, right? So Pharaoh's daughter is also an Ivri in that sense. So Moses grows up in Pharaoh's palace, but he sees the Hebrew slaves as his brothers, right? And again, the text does not actually tell us if he knows that he is ethnically Hebrew or not at this point. At this point, the text has not specifically said, I mean, the fact of the matter is that many of us get our ideas about the text from pop culture, right? And so how do we know this story? Right? Right? The Midrash according to Cecil B. DeMille, right? So if we saw the Ten Commandments, then Moshe knows that he's a Hebrew. But right, but when he goes out and he sees the Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew and he kills him, the text has not told us at this point that he knows he's a Hebrew, right? It's entirely possible that he believes that he is, in fact, ethnically Egyptian, right? And where is my proof text for this? All right. When so he kills the Egyptian taskmaster and he has to flee, right? And he flees to the desert and he goes to Midian and he encounters Jethro's daughters and he saves them from other shepherds. And what do they tell their father? Ish mitzri hetzilanu miyadam, right? An Egyptian man saved us from the other shepherds. Doesn't say Ish Ivri, doesn't say a Hebrew man saved us. It says an Egyptian man saved us. Okay, now, later commentators and later Midrashim will say that this is one of the reasons that Moses couldn't enter the promised land. All right, because when when Jethro's daughters said praised him and called him an Ish Mitzri, he should have said, Slicha, Slicha, Ani Ivri lo Mitzri, right? Sorry, I'm a Hebrew, not an Egyptian. But he didn't, and so instead of being a Kiddush Hashem, because they would see how wonderful the Jews are, they thought he was a wonderful Egyptian, right? But at any rate, he's Egyptian enough to to fuel Pharaoh's daughters, right? But whether Moses saw himself as a Hebrew or an Egyptian, he had this sense of shared humanity. And this sense of shared humanity is what we need to redeem the world into us, to redeem the world, right? I believe actually that every people has a word for everybody who's not part of us, right? I mean, for the Greeks, it was barbarian, right? For us, it's what? Goyim, right? Um, and I know I once knew, but I know that the Chinese have a name for all non-Chinese. The Japanese have a name for all non-Japanese. Um, and this is a natural thing, right? But to d- divide the world into an us and them is not the same as us against them, right? And we have to have a sense of common humanity. All right. And I'll share actually an example of that. I mean, it happens interestingly enough. When I went to visit my brother a couple of weeks ago, and so when my dad died, but his wife is still, thank God, with us, and so a lot of the things that he owned that weren't important enough to be left in a will or whatever, because the will isn't enacted anyway, because my stepmother's still alive, but things my dad owned, right? And so, but my stepmother moved from Queens to Brookline, Massachusetts recently, and so my brother, picked up a whole
Well, here's what the Reb's frozen. At least he is to me.
Rabbi, if you can hear us, you're frozen.
He just logged
He
off.
just logged off, so
Here he comes.
there we go.
Now you're muted.
Now you're muted.
I saw you were all frozen, and I realized that you probably were not, in fact, all frozen. I was probably frozen. So, what's the last thing you remember hearing?
You were talking about your brother picking up stuff from
And your father.
Okay, great. So, I happen to be wearing my dad's tallis this morning. My my brother's a Unitarian, doesn't have much use for a tallis. So, and actually, it's fair that I have it because I actually bought this for him in Mea Shearim decades ago. But I happen to be wearing my dad's tallis, and it reminds me that the last coherent conversation that I had with my dad before he was too ill to really communicate was during the horribly botched American evacuation from Kabul. And if you remember the scenes of people trying to literally hang on to airplane wings and chasing the airplanes and desperately trying to get out any way they could. And my dad said, I look at them and I see us. I look at them and I see us, right? Because how many times in Jewish history, all right, the details may be a little bit different, but the overarching idea is the same, right? People in desperate terror, in desperate fear, trying to flee and unable to do so. And this is the kind of humanity we have to have. When you see, you don't say, oh, I see Muslims who probably hate Jews. No, I see us because they're human beings, right? Don't look at people, and I believe me, I understand that the situation at the southern border is a mess, and we cannot possibly simply let in every person who wants to come. I understand that, and the fact that it's a mess is not really the administration's fault. It's really Congress's fault for refusing to pass any sort of sensible immigration legislation, right? But when we look at people who are fleeing for their lives, we have to see not people who are going to poison our nation's bloodstream, right? Poison our nation's bloodstream, right? No, believe you, 100, 125, 150 years ago, people were talking about Jews poisoning our nation's bloodstream. It is the same exact rhetoric, okay? Or as the Hebrew phrase would be, Otaki veret b'shinui aderet, right? Same lady in a different dress. Okay, this is exactly the same lady in a different dress. And we have to, whatever your position on how many we should admit, how they can be vetted, how they could, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is legitimate disagreement. But we have to see people who are suffering as our fellow human beings. And redemption will only come when we look at other people and see human beings rather than some kind of racial or ethnic or political or religious characterization. And this, I think, is the lesson that we learn from Shifra and Pua, who to this day we still don't know whether they were Hebrews who were midwives or Egyptian midwives who took care of the Hebrews. Shabbat Shalom. If there are questions or comments, please go right ahead.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yeah.
So getting back to the ambiguity about Moses' ethnic identity and whether he understood himself to be an Egyptian or an Israelite. I mean, I suppose that presupposes that he was not circumcised before he was placed in the basket, because the Egyptians didn't circumcise. Right?
Well, yeah, I guess. I don't know. That's a great question.
He was 3 months old when he was
Right,
placed
he
in the
was
basket.
3 months old when he was put in the basket, so presumably he would have been circumcised, right? And of course, when Pharaoh's daughter sees him, she says this is a Hebrew child, right? But does she assume that from the circumstances, or does she assume that from the fact that he looks like Charlton Heston and not like Yul Brynner? I don't know. That's a really good question to which, in fact, I have no answer. But I mean, if you're correct, and I did not know that the Egyptians didn't circumcise, but that would certainly lend credence to the idea that he knew himself to be ethnically Hebrew, which would also lend credence to the idea that he was punished for, staying silent when they called him an Ish Mitzri rather than an Ish Ivri, right? Because you shouldn't really punish somebody for not knowing, right? And if he actually thought at that point that he was in fact an Ish Mitzri, then it wouldn't be wrongdoing for him not to speak up and say, "Hey, I'm actually Ivri." So, the weight of that evidence leads towards the idea that he did in fact know his origins. Thank you for that. Great question.
I bring up one question.
Yeah,
If
sure.
he was high in the hierarchy of the Egyptian government, why would he feel that he had to run from taking some aggressive action against a slave master? He could have essentially said, by my position, I deemed this gentleman wrong, and I had to take some action. Why?
Well, because no, it's again a good question. I mean, presumably because even in the Egyptian government they had rules, right? And if you're a taskmaster, it's not wrong to beat a slave, right? So for Moses to simply say, "Well, I saw what he was doing; it was wrong, and I had to take action," it's not a legitimate concern. I mean, I don't know what the rules of immunity were uh, within the Egyptian government, and whether he could have simply claimed immunity. But I don't think so. I mean, it wasn't it from the perspective of the Egyptian government. What Moses did would not have been justifiable homicide, right? In the same way that if, I don't know, in the antebellum South, if somebody killed, right, an overseer for beating a slave, that wouldn't be justifiable homicide in the context of the laws of, Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi. That would definitely not be justifiable homicide, seems to me. I mean, we don't know for a fact what those rules were, but
No, it's just a question in a sense that he was in a very high position, and to suddenly say I got to run now because of this, you're right. We don't know the laws and the hierarchy of the laws.
right. But I would imagine it would not have been considered justifiable homicide within the context of the Egyptian system at that time. All right.
Good Shabbos.
Anyone else? All right. So I'll stop the recording.
Rabbi, I have a mea culpa too.